Well, welcome everyone to Philosophy Night, and the theme tonight is actually natural theology. The packet says natural philosophy, which I guess is correct also. Well, let's begin with a prayer. We'll stand and pray the Angelus and face the cross. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. The angel of the Lord declared unto Mary, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death.
Behold, the handmaid of the Lord.
Be it done unto me according to thy will.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death.
And the Word was made flesh. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Pray for us, O Holy Mother of God. Let us pray. Pour forth, we beseech thee, O Lord, thy grace into our hearts, that we, to whom the incarnation of Christ thy Son was made known by the message of an angel, may by his passion and cross be brought to the glory of his resurrection, through the same Christ our Lord. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Well, tonight's discussion will be based upon a humble little book here called Natural Theology by D.Q. McInerney. And this is a textbook that was written for the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter, for their seminarians. And I've gotten a couple of his books. I've used his books for a couple of different philosophy nights over the years. I find them very straightforward, and just sometimes you just need a good textbook for something like this. So I'll be quoting from his book throughout. I just sort of pulled little sections out of it to lead us through a discussion here. I'm going to simplify this, and we're not going to go into the arguments against these proofs for the existence of God, but we're going to look through a genealogy of thought going back to the time of Plato. Well, first of all, let's just ask the question, what is natural theology? And the answer is that natural theology, in this we study God and everything that pertains to God from a purely natural point of view, meaning that we advance our study on the basis of human reason alone. So that differs from sacred theology. So this is natural theology differing from sacred theology. Sacred theology is based upon what we can know by divine revelation. So we consider that philosophy is the foundation upon which we lay our theology. Because God has given us rational minds, he's given us intellects, so we can think, we can arrive at things, and then we receive divine revelation, and we receive grace that allows our intellects to reach higher heights. We can understand more profound things, and certainly the things of God, and even of natural things, with a greater depth or profundity through sanctifying grace. But we're going to avoid sanctifying grace. Well, no, I don't want to put it that way. We don't want to avoid sanctifying grace. We're going to avoid that which requires divine revelation, and we're just going to stick to what can be known by the natural use of our reason alone. And this is helpful because if you get in a conversation with somebody, and these days especially, someone's going to say, well, I don't care what your Bible says. If they don't believe in it, why? They don't care what the Bible says. And so if you can make an intelligent case for something, not appealing to theology, not appealing to divine revelation, that can be the beginning of a conversation that can then go someplace. It can go toward theology. It can go toward divine revelation. But in the beginning, sometimes with certain people, you might find that you need to just speak on the level of reason. Now, another good reason to learn philosophy or to read philosophical types of books or articles is that we're all formed by philosophy. We're all formed by the philosophy of the day. We just don't know it. But our values, our ways of coming to conclusions about things have all been fed to you through the education you received, through the television and television news or whatever source of news that you have, whether it's whatever media, whatever way that you receive information. You are being formed philosophically by this particular era or this particular generation. Every generation goes through its philosophies, the way that everybody thinks. And you might have realized or you might have noticed that we talk about things differently here in the church than people out in the neighborhood do, or people in the workplace, or people in academia. Because we have a different philosophy. We've been formed to think in a different way. We come to different conclusions than they do. And sometimes it's like we're just speaking completely different languages. So it's very helpful to at least dabble a little bit in philosophy, and especially what we call the perennial philosophy. Perennial philosophy is referred to as the generally like Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, and that genealogy of thought. And that's what we're going to look at today. I mean, there are others. We're going to look at St. Anselm. There's also St. Bonaventure and Duns Scotus, and certainly there are other historical philosophers. Well, let's continue. The principal purpose of the believing natural theologian is to show that man can come to have knowledge of God through means other than divine revelation. Specifically, the natural theologian seeks to demonstrate the natural reason, that is, human reason unaided by revelation, is able to attain certain knowledge that God exists, and in addition is able to attain knowledge of some of the aspects of the divine nature. So today we're just going to look at a genealogy of thoughts, of proofs for the existence of God. We won't go into the aspects of the divine nature. But we'll start with the Platonic proof. Now we have reason to believe that the philosophic science we now call natural theology began with Plato, to be found in Book 10 of Plato's Laws. Now, if you're familiar with Plato, you might know that in most of his dialogues he uses Socrates as the philosopher. In this case, we don't have Socrates, we have the Athenian. And the Athenian and his interlocutors expressed their concern that so many of the youth of that city are advocating views which are essentially atheistic. So you see, nothing changes. Those youth and their atheistic ways. Specifically, the youth have adopted the position that nature, which is to say material reality, takes precedence over soul or spiritual reality. They argue that the most primitive reality is material, and out of that came the soul or spiritual reality. So the matter came, they are arguing, the atheists, that matter came first and then spirit. Well, this to the Athenian and his companions is to have things just backwards. For it is a soul that comes first, and out of soul comes material reality or nature. Before there was matter, there was spirit, and matter proceeds from spirit. And that is the point the argument is intended to show. Now, we're not thinking about divine revelation at this point, but of course it reminds us, we who are believers, it reminds us of that. It reminds us that God is pure spirit who existed from all eternity, and then Out of his mouth he spoke the word, and all things were made. So that spirit comes first and then matter. So this is consistent with what we believe, and yet we, other than my comment here, we're not talking about God or divine revelation at this point. This is philosophy. Now the Athenian, according to the Athenian, everywhere we look there are things, material objects, and these things are constantly in motion. And motion can be classified as a thing that is capable of moving other things, but not itself, and B, a thing that is capable of moving both itself and other things. That's the most important kind of motion. So an example of something capable of moving other things but not itself would be, for instance, a billiard ball that is moved by another billiard ball. It can't move itself, but because another billiard ball or a cue stick has hit that ball, then that ball is able to move another ball. But it's not able to move itself. It must be moved by the cue stick or by another ball. And then there is the thing that is capable of moving both itself and other things. So we could say that the thing capable of moving itself is Brother Paphnutius. He is capable of getting up and crossing the room and grabbing that cue stick and hitting the billiard ball. I mean, not that Brother Paphnutius would be playing billiards, but he would be able to, he would have the capacity to do so. All right, this self-moving motion can generate itself and is infinitely superior to all else. And in other words, the thing that can move itself and something else is superior to something that can't move itself. And it must be recognized as first in ancestry as well as in power. All right, now the Athenian. Considering all the multitudinous instances of motion that are taking place in the universe, where one thing produces change in another thing, and then that thing in turn produces change in yet another thing, and so on and so on. In considering such a sequence, he asks, is there to be found an originating source of all the change that is taking place? If there is such a source, it cannot be something whose motion is explained by something outside itself. No, this initial principle can hardly be anything except the change effected by self-generated motion. So, well, this gets us thinking that maybe Brother Paphnutius doesn't actually move himself, but we'll get to that later. It is soul, then, or spiritual reality, which is the most ancient thing there is, and which is the generating source of all material reality, and matter thus takes second place in relation to spirit. So that's the Platonic proof. Oh, there's a little bit more here. A soul or souls, and perfectly virtuous souls at that, have been shown to be the cause of the phenomena, that is, of all moving material things, and whether it is by their living presence in matter that they direct all the heavens, or by some other means, we shall insist that these souls are gods. So there is the first proof for the existence of gods, or God. So we see here an argument for there being a need for something that would cause the movement of everything else that was not caused by anything else but itself. So that's the beginning. And now we continue with that thought. And this thought then, it develops. So we move on to Aristotle, who was a student in the Platonic school. So according to Aristotle then, the two governing ideas in Aristotle's proof, ideas which will later be adopted by St. Thomas and taken as his own, are as follows. 1, everything moves. Everything that moves, Everything that moves, that is, anything that changes in any way whatsoever, is moved by another. And 2, in any system of moving things, all of which are dependent for their movement on something other than themselves, one eventually must arrive, in order to explain all of this movement, at a mover which is not dependent on another. Isn't this interesting, that this argument, a proof for the existence of God, comes down to motion and change, and that they both attach onto this argument. Well, the fundamental philosophical explanation for the fact that everything that moves, that is, everything that changes, is moved by another, is found in the very important metaphysical distinction between potency and act, as it is applied to motion. So, potency and act. So, for instance, something has the potential to do something else. And a later example will be that a green apple has the potential to become a red apple if it ripens. Now, there are green apples that stay green, but normally a green apple, you can expect it to at least have a little shade or blush of red as it ripens. So a green apple has the potential or potency to become a red apple, but if it is a green apple, then it hasn't acted on that potency yet. It's still green. If it's a red apple, then it has acted, and it's no longer potentially a red apple, it is a red apple. So you have the potentiality, or the potency, and the act itself. All right, let's continue. Okay. What's that? Obviously? Oh, is that where I ended? Okay. Obviously, nothing could move in a particular way unless it had the capacity or the potential to do so. So, in other words, a green apple does not have the potentiality to become a pear. It's an apple, but it doesn't have the potentiality to ripen into a pear. So it can't do that. It can only ripen into an apple, a more ripe apple. So it can only move in a particular way if it has the capacity or the potential to do so. Now, something that is moving in a particular way here and now is said to be in act with respect to that movement. Now, nothing can be both in potency and in act with respect to a particular movement. That would involve a contradiction. In other words, the green apple is in potency, the red apple is in act. It couldn't be both the green apple and the red apple at the same time. It might be a partially red apple with some green in it, but that would be a ripe apple as opposed to an unripe apple. So a ripe apple cannot be said to be unripe, according to this example. So that would be a contradiction. Of course, a ripe apple can always get more ripe, and then it's too ripe and you have to throw it away. But just suffice to say that once it's ripe, it's no longer unripe. Once it's red, it's no longer green. Okay, so now nothing can be both in potency and in act with respect to a particular movement, for that would involve a contradiction. A non-moving thing could not cause its own motion, for in order to do so, it would have to be both non-moving and moving at the same time. Now, if we have a system, for example, the actual universe, which is composed of things which move, but no one of which can of itself provide the explanation for its movement, we have to ask, well, where did the system itself come from? Whence all this movement which cannot explain itself? How did the earth start moving? Was there ever a time when the earth was not moving? When did it start to turn? And why does it turn this way and not that way? What is the explanation for this? The movement cannot explain itself. The idea Aristotle is developing here might be easier to grasp if we think of a series of things, all of which are moved by another, that is, no one of which contains within itself the explanation of its movement or its motion. So a series of things. And you see things moving, and you know, for instance, that this billiard ball was hit by that one, that was hit by that one, that was hit by that one, that was hit by the cue. But you wouldn't just have this endless number of billiard balls. They would either sooner or later come to a stop, or you'd just have an endless, infinite number of billiard balls. But when did it ever begin? I mean, certainly there must have been a billiard ball that started it all, or could a billiard ball begin this movement? What began the movement? What is the explanation for this? Well, if we simply claim that the series is endless, we provide no explanation at all for that movement. We must then, Aristotle argued, conclude the existence of a first mover, by which he meant a mover which is the explanation for everything that moves, but which is itself unmoving. Now, right here in the fact that Aristotle's explanatory source of movement is unmoving, we see a stark contrast to Plato's explanatory source of movement, which was described as self-moving. So here's the difference. Plato spoke about something self-moving, but Aristotle speaks of something that is unmoving, something that doesn't move itself. It doesn't move, but it moves other things. For Aristotle, movement or change, even if generated by the moving beings itself, would be a sign of imperfection. If something moves or changes, then it's imperfect, whereas something that doesn't move or change, that is always the same, is perfect. Now, we can think about that use of the word perfect. Perfect means complete and unchanging. For instance, we are imperfect until we die. When we die, then we say that our life is perfected, it's completed, because at that point you can look back on somebody's life and say, oh, okay, well, this life is this. And it's complete. It's perfect. Even if it were a perfect disaster, it would be a perfect disaster, because that disaster would be completed. Or it could be a perfect miracle, a perfect blessing, perfect wonder. But nevertheless, it would be completed, therefore it would be perfect, unchanging. So as long as something is changing or moving, then it is inferior. Now, something that never changes or moves is even more superior. Now, we must not imagine this first mover as being the first in a series of the kind of moving things described above. The first mover is the explanation for this series itself, but is completely outside the series. So let's just say that we have Brother Paphnutius, the cue stick, and the billiard balls, but this mover is none of those. And yet this mover is responsible, or this mover has provided that first movement that brought about Brother Paphnutius and the cue ball and the billiard balls. There is then only one movant, that is mover, the first of unmoved things, which being eternal will be the principle of motion to everything else. This prime mover, though the cause of all physical movement, is itself immaterial, without parts, and without magnitude. Now, without parts, and there we see a definition that we refer to as simple. Something that is simple cannot be divided because it has no parts. So, for instance, we'll look at divine revelation here. We have the Holy Trinity, which is three persons in one God, but it has no parts. So they're not three parts, though they are three persons, but God is simple. God cannot be divided into parts. And that's a mystery of divine revelation. But here we're speaking about, again, something that has no parts. In the Metaphysics now using the term God rather than prime mover, Aristotle writes, "We say therefore that God is a living being, eternal, most good, so that life and duration, continuous and eternal, belong to God, for this is God." And there we have the second proof, again from ancient Greece, from Aristotle. Now we're going to move into the Christian era, and we'll first look at Augustine, who was a Platonist. He was influenced by Plato and that line of philosophy. And you'll see that we continue these themes. Though St. Augustine, of course, maintained that we have a sure knowledge of the existence of God through faith, he was a man of faith, he was a Christian, so we're in the Christian era now. He also makes clear that we can arrive at such knowledge through natural reason, albeit this knowledge, in comparison with that which comes to us through faith, is a sure though as yet very inadequate form of knowledge. So it's inadequate, it's lesser. And it's clear when you hear his argument that it is lesser. It is a lesser argument. But nevertheless, we're looking at, well, what can we arrive at by the natural use of our reason? We cannot arrive at that which we would expect to know as Christians because of divine revelation. So we have to set that aside for now for this study and just think about what can be known by our natural use of reason. If we had never heard the gospel, if we'd never been baptized, if we had never met a Christian before. Now, if one sets out to prove the existence of God, one must obviously have at the outset some sort of understanding of the term God. And St. Augustine begins his argument by asserting that we call that reality God, which has nothing superior to it. So you see the Greeks, not having heard the gospel, not knowing any Christians, not having divine revelation, the Greeks were still arriving at this thing that was primary, that was greater than everything else, unmoving, eternal. So this idea of God is not necessarily dependent on divine revelation. So what we call that reality God, which has nothing superior to it. And it is precisely truth, he contends, which is the reality that has nothing superior to it. Truth has nothing superior to it. This he endeavors to show by calling attention to two principal manifestations of truth: mathematics and wisdom. Mathematics. Isn't that interesting? There is in mathematical truth, according to St. Augustine, something of the eternal. For 7 and 3 are 10, not only now, but forever. 7 plus 3 equals 10. And that is always true. That's true forever. Number has to it a certain transcendent aspect, and therefore by knowing number, that is, any mathematical truth, we are led to a reality which is superior to our own mind. Truth which is superior to the human mind, a truth which provides the guidelines for the workings of the mind, cannot be a product of the mind itself. Now that's a really interesting point there. Truth cannot be a product of the mind itself. The mind apprehends truth. The mind reaches toward truth. The mind seeks truth. And when the mind finds truth, it is transcendent of that mind. Now we could say that the whole study of philosophy, philosophia, is the study of the love of wisdom or truth, seeking after wisdom, which is superior to the mind, but the mind can reach at that. All right, let's see here. Our minds are changeable, But this truth which guides the mind is unchangeable. The fact that the human mind is able to know truth at all, but especially mathematical truth, points necessarily then to something which is superior to the mind, truth by which the mind knows truth itself. And then he writes, this is his treatise on the free choice of the will. You granted that if I could prove that there was something above our minds, you would admit it was God, providing that there was nothing higher. I agreed and stated that it would be enough for me to prove this point. For if there is anything more excellent, then this is God. If not, then truth itself is God. In either case, you cannot deny that God exists, which was the question we proposed to examine in our discussion. So it's a philosophical exercise for St. Augustine to explain this thing that is above our minds. But still, we see that it is a lesser form of knowledge. It is arriving at a profound thought, for sure. It's a profound thought, but still, it is a lesser knowledge than what we would receive through sacred theology, through divine revelation. Well, let's move on to St. Anselm. St. Anselm was a religious, a monk in the 11th century. And he has a famous argument called the ontological argument. This is from his work called the Proslogion. And this is what he writes. And so, Lord, do thou who dost give understanding to faith, give me, so far as thou knowest it to be profitable, to understand that thou art, as we believe, and that thou art that which we believe. And indeed we believe that thou art a being, than which nothing greater can be conceived. Or is there no such nature, since the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God? But at any rate, this very fool, when he hears of this being of which I speak, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, understands what he hears, and what he understands is in his understanding, although he does not understand it to exist. For it is one thing for an object to be in the understanding, and another to understand that the object exists. When a painter first conceives of what he will afterward perform, he has it in his understanding, but he does not yet understand it to be, because he has not yet performed it. But after he has made the painting, he both has it in his understanding, and he understands that it exists, because he has made it. Hence even the fool is convinced that something exists in the understanding, at least than which nothing greater can be conceived. For when he hears of this, he understands it. And whatever is understood exists in the understanding. And assuredly that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone, then it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater. Therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. But obviously this is impossible. Hence there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. And that is the famous ontological argument that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And this is similar to what St. Augustine said, that, what did he say? St. Augustine said, that we call that reality God which has nothing superior to it. But in this case, God is that nothing greater can be conceived. And if anything greater could be conceived, then that would be God, of which nothing greater could be conceived. So there's the idea of something that exists in your mind. I mean, if it exists in your mind, then then you have an understanding of it. Now, but here we have the idea that it can exist. If it can exist in the mind, if it exists only in the mind, then you understand it only in the mind, and then when it exists in reality, you understand it on a different level. Let's read this last part again. Therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. In other words, if it is only an idea, then something greater can be conceived of it. Whereas if it exists, then nothing greater can be conceived. But obviously this is impossible, than which a greater can be conceived. This is obviously impossible. Hence there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. Now, I'm introducing these things to you. Maybe you've heard these before, or maybe this is all new to you. But even so, you're going to ponder over this. You're going to ponder over it, because you'll probably come up in your mind with arguments. Well, what if somebody said such and such? But you're going to ponder over these things. And this is an introduction. So we're not going into all the arguments against these proofs. But we're looking at this genealogy of thought. We're looking at these various proofs, and it's really something for us to chew on. And as you do so, and even if you were to go back and read over that proslogion from St. Anselm again, tomorrow, it's likely you'd get something more out of it. I've been reading over these for the last couple days and making my notes and preparing this packet for tonight's talk. And each time I read it, I understand it a little, on a little bit deeper level. Sometimes you have to just get it in there and let it settle and sleep on it, and then you come back to it. And maybe you come back to it tomorrow, maybe you come back to it next week or 6 months from now. And maybe it's all just going over your head now. But 6 months from now, if you were to come back and read this, I would bet that it would be very obvious. Oh, how did I not get this before? It's just so obvious. Well, that's how your mind works. And I remember a philosophy professor telling us this: if you don't understand what you're reading, just keep reading it. And at the end of the chapter, there'll be a summary. And that's usually, it's true. At the end of the chapter, it summarizes everything, and you sort of get it. But even so, in a classroom setting, you read the material, and then your professor lectures on it and explains it, and then you come back to it again at the end of the midterm or the semester, and it makes more sense because you read it and you heard it lectured. Unless, of course, you didn't read your homework and you didn't go to class. And then you're preparing for your final the night before. And, well, what can you expect? So we're introducing these things to you now, and I encourage you to come back and read through these again after a good night's sleep, or after a week or 2 or 6 months, because this is classic stuff here. Yes, Robbie. Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Spirit, or soul, a pure soul, but nevertheless capable of moving itself. Whereas Aristotle, so that's Plato, and then Aristotle has the prime mover, the first mover, being unmoved, and eternal and perfect, unchanging. All right, well, let's move on now to the 5 ways of St. Thomas Aquinas. But before we look at the actual 5 ways, we're going to go through some of the vocabulary so that when we read through them, they'll make more sense to you. Okay, so first of all, we'll talk about, so these are referred to by McInerney as the metaphysical foundations of the proofs. So first, let's take a look at substantial being. So substantial being is independent being in relation to accidental being. So a being refers to something that is. So substantial being, and we have accidental being. Now, accidental being can only exist through other being, that is, substantial being, but substantial being exists again through itself. A substance is an actual existent, a real being, and not a fiction. All right, well, that's a lot to go into, isn't it? So a substantial being is something that actually exists that brings about accidental beings. Okay, we'll come back to that, and actually we'll continue that a little bit here. Okay, I'll make sure you understand what that means, and if I don't, then raise your hand and tell me to explain more. Well, let's move on to contingent being and necessary being. There is only one unqualifiedly necessary being, and that is God himself. As a necessary being, God is a being for whom it is impossible not to be. We arrive at the existence of God as necessary being by beginning with contingent being. Now, if necessary being is being that cannot not be, the essence of contingent being is that it is being that can not be. So a contingent being can not exist, whereas necessary being cannot not exist. Does that make sense? Okay. It's a little bit play on words there. St. Thomas often uses the expression participated being in referring to contingent being. Now, contingent being participates in being in the sense that in contrast to necessary being, which simply is being, contingent being has being as a possession that comes to it from outside and by way of gift. Now, we know ourselves as contingent beings. We are contingent beings, for we know that at one time we did not exist. I remember at 8 years old, looking in the mirror and thinking, where did I come from? Where was I before I was? I remember thinking that when I was 8 years old. Where was I before I was? And what will it be? How is it possible that I couldn't not be? I remember having that thought. And here I'm finally finding the answer. Age of 56. So we know ourselves as a contingent being, for we know that at one time we did not exist, and we know that someday, with respect to our present mode of existence, as creatures composed of body and soul, we will cease to exist. Now our soul, we believe that our souls live on after our bodies die. But nevertheless, as these bodies will cease to exist in the way that they exist now. And we contingent beings immersed in a veritable sea of contingent beings. We're surrounded by other contingent beings. Okay, we'll move on then. And these things will all come back when we look at the 5 ways of St. Thomas. Next thing we look at is potency and act. We spoke about potency and act already with the green apple that becomes the red apple. So Aristotle identified the essence of motion, or of any change of whatever sort, as the actualization of a potency. There is first and foremost, and obviously, the thing that undergoes the change. And then there is the change itself, which can be broadly described as a transition from one state to another. A green apple can become a red apple because it has the capacity for that kind of qualitative change. And more precisely, we say that a green apple has the potency to become a red apple, or that a green apple is in potency with respect to the red apple. Now the apple is now in act with respect to greenness, and in potency with respect to redness. So in other words, the red apple is no longer green, and therefore it is in act. But the green apple is in potency as in respect to redness because it doesn't have it yet. And the privation of the green apple is redness, for that is precisely what it lacks, and toward which the change will be directed. We say that the change is the actualization of a potency because what is happening in change is the realization, the bringing into actual being of a specific capacity in a thing that has that capacity. Now, we're going to move beyond the apple, but we can understand the apple because it's simple. In this case, it would be a green apple capable of becoming a red apple, actually becoming a red apple. Contingent being is changing being for better or worse. Okay, so we are contingent beings because we are changing. We are aging. Our hair is growing, or our hair is receding, or we have no hair that we used to have. We have to cut our hair, or we wish that we might have some hair that we could cut and don't. Nevertheless, we are changing beings for better or worse. Okay, the next concept here, whatever is moved by another. Here, movement is to be understood as referring to any change whatever. No thing that changes can of itself account for the change that it is undergoing. This principle is not immediately self-evident. It's not immediately self-evident. It takes a little study to arrive at this. Consider now the case of Dorothea, whom we observe sitting in a chair in her room. This will be similar to what we spoke about with Brother Paphnutius. Consider now the case of Dorothea, whom we observe sitting in a chair in her room reading. We observe her put her book aside, rise from the chair, and walk across the room to the window. And what we observed was this physical thing, a human body, move from one place to another. It was a body that moved, but it was moved by something other than itself. We can confidently say that what moved Dorothea's body was Dorothea's will, a faculty of her rational soul. So her body did not move itself. It was moved by her rational soul, by her will. Okay, now we move on to the principle of causality. According to St. Thomas, a cause is that upon which a thing depends, either for its very existence or for any changes it may undergo as an existent. So there is a cause to my changes. The cause for my hair growing is the passage of time. The change of my hair turning gray is the passing of the years and all the wisdom that I have taken on. And all the stresses of life turn my hair gray. And maybe some genetics along with that. But you see, that is not something that I have, that's not something that I have control over. I mean, we have a certain amount of control over, we have a certain amount of control. I mean, I could dye my hair, or I could put, that stuff on to make my hair grow, or something like that. But it wouldn't change the fact that my hair is actually gray, even if it has dye on it. Contingent being that cannot account for its own existence. Necessary being is the efficient cause of contingent being in the most radical of ways, for it calls contingent being into existence out of nothing. Before contingent being exists, there is nothing. In order for contingent being to cause itself, it would have to precede itself. But because nothing precedes the existence of contingent being, the purported cause of something would be nothing. But from nothing, you get nothing. So before I existed, there was nothing. I cannot go back and cause my own existence, because from nothing can only come nothing. So there must be something, some necessary being that is capable of creating everything out of nothing. We move on to the impossibility of an infinite series of causes, and then we'll come to the first way. And these will make sense. You'll be glad we went through these. Turning the crank of a hand generator, A, activates an electric motor, B, which activates a mechanism, C, which causes a little flag to wave back and forth, and that's D. And as soon as one stops turning the crank, the motor and mechanism stop, and the little flag waves no longer. This is a series of accidentally subordinated causes, A, B, C, and D. This series is one in which simultaneous causal activity by all the causes in the series is not necessary. All that A, the first in the series, has to do is initiate causal activity. In other words, causal activity is only necessary from A. And as soon as A has initiated the series, all that A, the first in the series, has to do is to initiate causal activity, and its initiating action will continue down the series of subordinate causes, even though it no longer acts. So once A has begun the series and then stops, the rest will continue until the little flag waves, even if in the meantime A has shut off. Little flag will then stop waving, but it'll be waving even after A has shut off B, which is the motor. Now here's a better example. Let's see here. In our series, C can cause D only because here and now it is being caused by B, and the same is to be said of B in relation to A, which must be, we will say, a cause which causes other causes, but which is itself uncaused. In other words, A is not an effect as well as a cause. We might call it pure cause. You might remember that phrase, pure cause, going back to, what was that, Plato or Aristotle? Well, one of those. So it's a pure cause. It's an uncaused cause. It causes, but nothing causes it. Now think of a great-grandmother, a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter. The daughter exists because at one time in the past, her great-grandmother exercised the causal activity, which is human generation. The daughter could get married and herself now exercise that kind of causal activity. But obviously her great-grandmother, who has long since gone to her reward, would not have to be herself exercising that activity in order for her great-granddaughter to be able to exercise it. This then is a series of accidentally subordinated causes. The question is, would it be possible that such a series might be infinite? In other words, could there be, antecedent to the great-grandmother cited above, a series of mothers that just went on and had no beginning? Where is it possible that there was no beginning to that line of mothers? That it would be infinite, that it would be eternal? Well, something had to cause the first mother to become a mother. Something has to cause that in the beginning. So to posit an infinite succession backward is tantamount to holding that succession proceeds from nowhere. But if the succession proceeds from nowhere, then there simply is no succession. Okay, that's our preparation now for the 5 ways of St. Thomas Aquinas. So now, any questions before we continue? Yeah. you speak a little bit louder?
But the idea is that with St. Anselm, you should be able to understand something, and in the sense it's like parallel communication, and know that it's potentially it exists, but the way you might know it exists is it's actually a higher reality. That doesn't, and I think I just said that, so I don't know. And the still by still thing, basically, that there are kinds of people who think of higher reality, but they have no theory for it, so you actually can't get to that. From that line of thinking,
Okay. Right. Well, a good point. It is a good point that you're making there. Like, you can have the conception of a higher reality without necessarily being able. You can understand it. You can come to a certain knowledge of God, even if you can't come to understand it. And I think St. Thomas is going to get to that too. That it takes basically that leap of faith takes meeting God and being brought to that faith, because faith is a gift, but it's also it also comes from grace that helps us to make that leap. But through natural reason alone, we can come to a certain knowledge of God without necessarily knowing God. And that sounds like what you're arriving at there. But it's irrational. An infinite series is irrational, and yet people choose to believe it, knowing that. Okay, let's move. Well, let's move on, because we want to get through these 5 ways, and I think this will come back to some of what you're saying here. So let's take a look at the 5 ways of St. Thomas Aquinas. This is from the Summa Theologica, the first part, question 2, article 3. And this is all within one answer that he gives all 5 of these ways. So I answer that the existence of God can be proved in 5 ways. We'll look at these one at a time. So the first way is the argument from motion. We've already heard about motion from Plato and Aristotle. The first, but we'll hear more. We'll hear that those ideas of Plato and Aristotle now brought to a greater fullness. The first and more manifest way is the argument from motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality toward that which it is in motion. So there we have the potentiality and the act. Whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can, so recall the apple. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Thus, that which is actually hot as fire makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, that is, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another. and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover. So if there's not a first mover, then nothing moves. But this cannot, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. That's the first way. We've been introduced to that all along. So he clarifies that, and he identifies this as being God. Now, the second way. This is the argument from efficient causality. The second way is from the nature of the efficient cause. In a world of sense, we find that there is an order of efficient causes. Now, by sense here, he's meaning sight, taste, touch, smell, hearing. In a world of sense, we find there is an order of efficient causes. There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself, for so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Now, in efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to infinity, because in all efficient causes, following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. In other words, so A, B, C, and D, the B and C are both intermediate causes. The A is the first cause, and D is the ultimate cause. So the person cranking the motor is intermediate, and the motor causing C to do whatever it did is another intermediate, but D is the flag that waves, and that's the ultimate cause. Okay, so there can be multiple intermediate causes. But if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to an infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, to which every one gives the name of God. Okay. We've been prepared for that argument as well. It should be fairly clear by this time. Now, the third way is the argument from contingent being. Remember that we are contingent beings because there was a time when we didn't exist, and there will be a time when, at least in our present form, we will not exist. The third way is taken from possibility and necessity and runs thus. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently they are possible to be and not to be. So there was a time when I was not, and yet now I am. So I am something that is possible to be and not to be, because once I was not, and now I am. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. Now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. And thus, even now, nothing would be in existence, which is absurd. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. Now, it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as has already been proved in regard to efficient causes. Therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. And this all men speak of as God. So that's the third way. Now, we've been prepared for all for all of those. These next two take a little bit more consideration. We haven't been so immediately prepared for them, but nevertheless, because of the other preparation we've had, these things will follow. So the fourth way is the argument from degrees of being. We haven't talked about degrees of being yet, but we can talk about this a little bit. So the fourth way is taken from the gradation to be found in things. Among beings there are some more and some less good, true, noble, and the like. But more and less are predicated on different things, according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum, as a thing is said to be hotter, according as it more nearly resembles that which is hottest, the most hot. So that there is something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and consequently something which is uttermost being. For those things that are greatest in truth and greatest in being, as it is written in Metaphysics 2, now the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus, as fire, which is the maximum heat, is the cause of all hot things. Therefore there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection, and this we call God. Now maybe another way of looking at this, we could look at it a couple ways. You maybe have heard about the transcendental qualities of God, that God is the one, true, good, and beautiful, and that all truth that we perceive or that we can think of is dependent upon God, who is all truth. So truth participates in the truth of God, or goodness participates in the goodness of God. So an ice cream cone, especially, during Lent, we shouldn't be thinking of things, but an ice cream cone is so good, but it's not as good as God is good. And we couldn't even compare an ice cream cone to God. We would say God is good, and this ice cream cone is good. But we mean two different things by that. God is the most good. There can be no good greater than God. There can be no truth greater than God. There can be nothing more beautiful than God. And yet the sunset is beautiful, but that beautiful sunset only participates in the beauty of God, which transcends the beauty of the sunset, or the goodness of God, which transcends the goodness of this ice cream cone, that participates in the goodness of God, but is not in itself the fullness of goodness. So that's one way we can look at this. But the other way is this. We will look about, this isn't in your copy, but it's in the book. We look about us in the world and we see a multiplicity of being, and in comparing these beings with one another, we immediately see that they are distinguishable in terms of more and less, more or less this, that, or the other thing, depending on the point of view from which we are assessing them. And when we reflect on this very common and ordinary way of responding to our world, we further see that the only reason we can make such comparisons is because in doing so, we are implicitly or explicitly making reference to something that is the most, the maximum, can be said to cause the comparative judgments we make, because such judgments would not be possible without the maximum. So in other words, you might see a delicious-looking cup of coffee, and you take a drink and you think, oh, this coffee is terrible, because you've had better coffee. You've had better coffee someplace. This coffee's terrible. But if you'd never had coffee, you'd still think it was terrible, but you'd think, well, this must be the best terrible coffee I've ever had, because I don't know how good coffee is, but maybe coffee's supposed to be terrible. So this is the best terrible coffee that I've ever had. Children who drink coffee usually think it's terrible. And then for some reason, as adults, we like it. Or maybe you appreciate a nice, fine, stout porter. And then you open up a can of some cheap lager and you think, this is nothing. You should taste this, German whatever, or whatever this great beer is. But you wouldn't know how bad this other beer was if you hadn't had this better beer. But then sooner or later there must be the best. What is the very best beer? Well, or what is the very best thing? And then you have a comparison of things that are less and more, things that are okay and things that are fine and things that are good, things that are great, things that are the best, right? And so it is with beings. Now let us think of in terms of sheer existence as being as opposed to non-being. So a single cell bacterium is not less existent than is a bald eagle, but they do not exist on the same level. The bald eagle represents a higher level of being than does the bacterium. We say he has more being than the bacterium, and so there are degrees of being. We conclude that there must necessarily exist a being that is the highest of all beings, for it would be incoherent to claim that there are degrees of being and yet deny the existence of a highest being. So that is an explanation then, or a commentary on the argument from degrees of being. The greatest being, there must also be something which is to all beings their cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection, and this we call God. And we go to the fifth argument here, the argument from finality. This is the fifth way of St. Thomas Aquinas. The fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end. And this is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. Hence it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly do they achieve their end. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move toward an end. So in other words, an inanimate object, it lacks intelligence. It cannot move toward an end unless it is directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence. As an arrow, for instance. An arrow is an inanimate object. It doesn't have intelligence, and yet, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer, the arrow shows intelligence. It does what it's supposed to do when it is shot correctly. This inanimate object expresses intelligence. Therefore, some intelligent being exists, by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So that's the fifth way. Now, this is a really interesting point here about the inanimate object. And here's a short commentary on that. Again, it's not in your packet, but it's in the book. The basic assumption with which the argument begins is that intelligence is to be found everywhere in nature, even where perhaps we would least expect to find it, in the activity of inanimate matter. Now, human beings clearly have intelligence, and higher animals have something analogous to intelligence. You know, we don't say that a dog has intelligence, but a dog has a sensitive soul. It has its use of seeing, of sight and smelling and tasting and hearing and such. But a dog we wouldn't call intelligent, although, Lassie was pretty smart. But whatever animal you want to consider, we would say that animal is smart or intelligent, but only analogously, because the animal doesn't have a rational brain. But it does have, we would say analogously that it has intelligence. But so we would also say, we would not be inclined to say that inanimate matter has intelligence. That rock has no intelligence. That basketball hoop has no intelligence. But it can be shown that even inanimate matter acts intelligently, and then we are forced to seek an explanation for that intelligent behavior apart from the inanimate matter itself. Now, empirical science can predict the future state or behavior of inanimate things precisely because, under certain conditions, these things will always act for the sake of a specific end that can be known beforehand. Things act as instruments. Or we could say that the sun is predictable. We know what the sun will do, but the sun has no intelligence, and yet we know that the earth will spin, and that the sun will appear to rise, although it is because the earth is moving, but it'll always arise in a predictable way throughout the seasons, and we can predict that. Scientists can predict what inanimate matter will do, and science can predict what animals will do. If only human beings were predictable. Well, I guess we're predictable to a certain extent. But the innate intelligent behavior of inanimate bodies cannot be explained in terms of those bodies themselves, for the simple reason that they lack intelligence. The source of the intelligent behavior of those bodies is then external to them. And that is the explanation of the fifth way, the argument from finality. Well, it's a quick introduction to some really classic thought, some basic foundational philosophy, what we call natural theology, the study of God by the use of our natural reason alone, without divine revelation, without faith, without supernatural faith. So I hope you'll ponder over this and come back and take a look at it again in a week or two.